أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Assalamu alaikum, dear students. Welcome to a session on listening. In this session, we will look at different aspects of listening as a communicative skill. We will have discussion on definition of listening. We will consider listening as a skill or communicative skill, types of listening, levels of listening, listening situations and materials, listening strategies, characteristics of an active or good listener, how to become an active listener, and barriers to and difficulties in listening. Listening is a receptive skill. Receptive means we receive and understand incoming information. That is, through listening as well as reading, we get inputs from the speakers or the writers. Listening is never a passive process. Listening is an active and purposeful process of making sense of what we hear. And remember, listening and hearing are two different levels. In our first language, listening starts automatically. That just after our birth, we start listening. So there is no problem with listening using the first language. And indeed, listening has a number of aspects. We use our brain, we use our cognitive faculty, we use our experience, we use our experience of language, experience of the real world for getting the best meaning or the exact meaning out of listening. But in second language or L2, listening is very challenging because the necessary or the required faculties that we need for listening work subconsciously while we are listening in our first language, but in our second language listening, we have to make all these faculties work consciously. Listening inputs are of higher level than we can produce. Still, we can understand. When we listen to somebody, we do not know what they will speak about. And a child can listen to an adult, and of course, a child cannot speak like an adult. For example, now you are listening to me, and of course, I am speaking about something which you cannot produce. So, listening inputs, what you get through this listening, these inputs are of higher level than you can produce. But still, we can understand, or you can understand now what I am speaking about. And we have no influence over what we listen to until and unless there is a mutual cooperation or interaction between the speaker and the listener. Thus, it is considered as a passive skill by many of us, but the truth is that listening is a very active skill or an active process. Again, it is not a passive process because we process not only what we hear, but also we connect the information or the inputs to other information we already have. And then we combine what we hear with our existing knowledge and experience. And finally, we indeed create meaning. And we create meaning in our own mind. So the meaning is not only 100% dependent on what we hear, but also what knowledge we have, what expectation we have in our mind. That is why it is no way, never a passive process. Bach in 1995 points out, meaning is not in the text, whatever is being listened to, but is something that is constructed by listeners based on a number of different knowledge sources. And what are those sources? The sources are knowledge of language, context, and general background knowledge. Listening is meaning-based and purposeful. As receptive skills, listening and reading share some aspects. Though listening and reading have some differences between them, like listening is concerned with oral, that is audio channel, while reading is based on visual channel, sight. But in both cases, inputs are analyzed by your cognitive faculty. but the patterns are markedly different. In listening, we consider sound, we listen to sound, but in reading, we are concerned about written signs, the letters, the sentences, etc. In listening, we have visual clues. Though we listen to somebody, at the same time, we can visualize what the speaker is speaking about. In listening, information is more dense. That is, in the same size of listening and reading text, you have more information in listening than reading. Reading discourse is highly structured and complex. We know that in listening, that is in speaking, when somebody speaks to us and we are listening, if there is any mistakes committed, the speaker can correct himself or herself. But when we read any written text, in written form, language is very formal and of course grammatically correct and grammatically complex. Let us talk about listening materials and situations. Indeed, we read different types of materials. Like we listen to radio and TV programs. We listen to public addresses, speeches and lectures. We also listen to telecustomer service recording. We also listen to, or we have listening when we converse with our friends and neighbors. And we also are engaged in listening situation when we answer or talk over telephones. There are three basic listening situations. Face to face, when we talk to somebody face to face directly and we get a lot of information. And face to face situation has non-verbal clues like body language, gestures, tone of voice, etc. And this face to face situation is influenced by the relationship between the speaker and the listener and the goal of the listening, goal of the conversation. It can be both formal and informal. We can listen to somebody face to face in a formal situation like a meeting and in some informal situation like a family conversation. The second listening situation happens in a large group when it is difficult to use non-verbal cues and there is less opportunity of talking because lot many participants are there, and it may be that a number of participants try to speak at the same time. But when we are engaged in large group discussion or listening situation, the focus is on the gist. The third listening situation is when we talk over telephone. It is more difficult than the other two situations because we cannot see the person we are talking to, and unless it is a video call. And here we have to rely on the responses of the speakers, and that is why we cannot use non-verbal cues. For example, you are speaking to or you are listening to someone, say no as a response, and at the same time you are using or you are nodding your head, but of course your listener cannot see what you are doing with your head, whether you are nodding or whether you are having a grimace on your face. There are three levels of listening, and we know that listening is a psychophysical process. The first level of listening is hearing. Hearing is the level when we just listen to somebody or something and we catch what is being said without getting the meaning, without understanding it. We just listen to what is said. And the second level is understanding. We need to understand using our brain, using our cognitive faculty, what we have heard. And the third level of listening is judging. After understanding what has been heard, we judge whether they, that is what we have understood or what we have heard and understood, make any sense or not, whether it is true or false, whether I believe in what I have heard or not. And if the information is believed, we act accordingly or likewise. And if we do not agree with what we have heard or we do not believe in what we have heard and understood, we do not act likewise, or we just put it for future use, and we want to try to judge with further experience if possible in the future, and only then we will believe in that information and act likewise. So here is the process of listening. First we hear what has been said or what is being said, then we understand or try to understand, and then we judge the information, and only after these three levels we can say that listening has been successful. As non-native users of English, we have some problems, or we face some problems in listening, and there are some phenomena which can create barriers and difficulties in listening. If you become unmindful and inattentive, you can miss the information. Sometimes we can be in physical or mental stress problem, and that can prevent us from getting the information, exact information spoken by the speaker. If we are bored, we may lose our concentration on what is being said. Sometimes some external factors like noise can create disturbance, and we can have difficulty in listening. If you have lack of interest in a topic, that can also create barrier in listening, and that can prevent you from getting the exact information. Sometimes we become too much interested with some particular word or phrase, and in listening, when you become preoccupied with some word or phrase, then you cannot follow the speaker. Sometimes the bad speaking style of the speaker, like using a lot of hazes, facial expressions, these things can create difficulty in listening. This can distract your listening concentration. There can be language barrier. You don't know the language the speaker is using or is speaking in. Clustering of words can also pose some difficulty. Sometimes the speakers can use redundant expression, which can also become a barrier to proper listening. In speaking, we use reduced forms or contracted form. We may misunderstand the speaker. There can be performance discrepancies. Rate of delivery is another aspect of listening. Sometimes the speaker can speak in a very fast pace, and we may not follow him or her. As non-native users of English, we cannot use stress, rhythm, and intonation of English properly. That is why there can be individualized differences in terms of stress, rhythm, and intonation, which may create problem in listening. If the language is unfamiliar, that also can create listening difficulty. For understanding, of course, the spoken signals have to be identified from the midst of surrounding words, and the continuous stream of speech has to be segmented into units, and only then we can understand. So doing these things at the same time while listening, becomes sometimes difficult for the listeners. The syntax of utterance has to be grasped for a speaker's intended meaning. From one perspective, there can be two types of meaning, that is intended meaning and interpreted meaning. The meaning which is used by the speaker is called intended meaning, and the meaning that as listeners we understand is called interpreted meaning. And there has to be cohesion between intended meaning and interpreted meaning. If the intended meaning and the interpreted meaning are different, there creates problem, and that is the most frequently occurring cause of quarrel. Mediating responses. Sometimes we try to, as listener, we give some clues to the speaker, and the speaker can give us some clues. And if there is problem between the speaker and the listener in regards to understanding the responses, then there can be difficulty in listening. Characteristics of a good listener. A good listener has some characteristics. A good listener shows interest in what is being said by way of keeping eye contact, nodding, making encouraging gestures, etc. A good listener is not distracted by other things. and they can concentrate on the speaker and what is being said. A good listener prompts for clarification. A good listener always tries to clarify the information he or she cannot understand, drawing attention of the speaker, or he can write down what he has not or she has not understood, and later on he or she can go for clarification from the speaker. A good listener keeps quiet or silent, but not passive. Remember, being passive and being quiet are not same. A good listener always encourages the speaker in case of being hesitated. Say if a speaker has some problems with his speaking, a good listener tries to encourage the speaker. A good listener, of course, does not keep interrupting the speech or the speaker, and does not discriminate among the speakers, and does not try to change the topic, and tries to figure out what is being said, but also why something has been said. That is, try to judge information against his or her knowledge. He or she becomes a critical listener. Kinds of listening. There can be different types of listening based on different criteria. The first one is active versus passive listening. Genuine interest in understanding what the other person is thinking, feeling, or what the message means. So when you are an active listener, you have this quality. And as an active listener, you check understanding before responding. First you understand what has been said, and then you respond. And as an active listener, you restate or paraphrase your understanding and send it to the speaker for verification or clarification. But in passive listening, you hear but stay passive and do not verify. Then we have holistic or global listening versus segmental or selective listening. In holistic or global listening, we listen to the whole text, but in selective listening, only specific segments of the text is listened to. Holistic listening should precede segmental one. That is, before you listen to a segment of the text, you should have a holistic listening. Holistic listening allows students to develop strategies and build stamina in processing listening text. On the other hand, selective listening is beneficial for intensive listening. It is selected by the instructor to enhance listening skill. Say, if I want to develop particular listening skill, I can give you some selective listening text, and you can do it for intensive listening skill development. Selective listening helps to adopt a strategy of focusing on specific information, for example. On the other hand, holistic listening helps understand and recall everything. And selective listening is often seen as a prerequisite for more complex and extended listening. The third one is interactive and non-interactive listening. Interactive listening means attentive listening, where you listen well and concentrate on what is being said without falling out of touch with the speaker and being therefore able to respond efficiently. For example, face-to-face telephone calls or listening in real-life situations are interactive, attentive listening situation or type of listening. In interactive listening, you are listening as well as responding or speaking alternatively, and there is chance for clarification. But in non-interactive listening, you have only one way of listening. For example, you are listening to radio, or you are watching a film, you are listening somebody on TV or lectures, and of course there is no opportunity to ask for clarification, and of course your speaker cannot see your responses, and there is no intermediate transmission of responses between the speaker and the listener. Top-down and bottom-up listening. When you are listening to something, you can bring some experience from your real-life knowledge, and using that knowledge you can interpret or comprehend the hard text. That is called top-down listening. And top-down listening starts with macro skills, that is meaning level skill, to micro level word. That is, you start with meaning first and then you get down to the word level meaning. On the other hand, bottom-up listening takes place when listeners segment speech into constituent chunks like sounds, words, or chain of words to form clauses and sentences, and then you go upwards to the meaning. That is, it starts with micro skill, that is word level skill, and then it goes up to the meaning level. Competitive listening. Competitive listening is a type of listening where you are not listening for getting information, rather you listen to only the important section and then you try to promote your own point of view. You are less interested in understanding or exploring the speaker's view. And in this type of listening, you are listening for flaws or weak points so that you can attack or you can refute those points. You pretend to pay attention and you are waiting for formulating rebuttal. That is, you are trying to refute the information that you receive from the speaker. The next one is intensive listening, which involves focusing on particular segments of the text, and it follows global comprehension of the text. Global comprehension is the understanding the very general ideas, establishing a preliminary framework to enable them to get details in subsequent listening. There can be different goals of intensive listening. Getting more detailed understanding of subsegments of the text, transcribing certain segments in the text, gauging meaning from context, looking at certain grammatical structures and how they aid comprehension, and it requires time and patience. Types of listening based on the goals of listening. There can be 3 types of listening on the basis of goals of listening. The first one is informational listening. That is, you are listening to something or listening to somebody for learning something, for getting the information. The second one is critical listening. You are listening for evaluating and analyzing the information. The third one is therapeutic or empathic listening. That when you listen to understand the feeling and the emotion of the speaker. Elements of active listening. Active listening has got some elements. The first one is comprehending. Shared meaning between parties in communication transaction. When we are engaged in communication or we transact or we give and take some information, we need to comprehend the information first. And this is the first element in listening. And what you have to do, you have to identify speech sounds, understand and synthesize the sounds as words. You have to pay attention to the appropriate sounds and you have to determine the meaning of the text. The second element of active listening is retaining. That is, you listen to the information and you try to be very attentive and you try to memorize the information for later use. The third element is responding, that you respond to what you are listening to. It can be verbal or non-verbal. You can respond to the speaker using language, or you can respond to the speaker using some non-verbal cues like gesture, posture, nodding, facial expression, etc. How to be an active listener? To be an active listener, you should practice having these things. First one is you should show affirmative head nods and appropriate facial expressions. You can also make eye contact, which shows that you are attentive and you are having interest in what is being said. Then you should listen carefully so that you may not miss any information which is being given. You should avoid distraction. Do not try to distract the speaker. Then you can go for paraphrasing, that is understanding the text in your own language. Then you can go for reflection, that is you should look back what has been said and try to understand it against your own knowledge and experience. You should go beyond the said words, because we do not understand what the words only tell us. We also try to understand about the words or the information against our own knowledge. And that is why it is important that you utilize your knowledge or experience for getting the meaning out of the said words. You should be patient when you are responding, when you are answering, and of course you should respond. You can respond in verbal or non-verbal ways. You can go for asking for clarification, and you should have positive body language. And of course you should be sympathetic, and you should be non-judgmental. So while you are listening, you should not judge something as inappropriate, and you cannot just discourage the speaker from speaking the rest of the text. There should be a smooth transition between the roles of a speaker and listener. When the speaker is speaking, and as listener, you should not take the turn of a speaker, that the speaker and listener should not speak at the same time. So you should wait for your turn, and only then you can go for asking for the flow of speaking, and then you should go for speaking. So there should be transition between the roles of speaker and listener. There can be 4 listening strategies: top-down, bottom-up, metacognitive, and macro strategies. Top-down means you start with your background knowledge and start with meaning. You do not look at the words, sounds, phrases at the beginning. On the other hand, bottom-up strategy refers to when you use sounds first, then words and phrases, and then you go upward, and finally you get the meaning, or you analyze the meaning against your background knowledge. Besides these strategies, Lynch in 2007 has divided listening strategies into some particular aspects, which are predicting, that when you listen you can predict what might be said or what might that person mean. Monitoring, that you can monitor what is being said and what you expected. So you already have predicted the text or the meaning of the text, and you can monitor whether the speaker is speaking or whether the text is giving information as per your prediction. Responding, that you respond to the speaker in verbal and non-verbal ways. You can go for clarification. You can go for inference. Inference means guessing something from the information provided. And finally, you can go for evaluating the information given in the text. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.